A while ago I found these drawers by some bins on a housing estate. They were nicely built with dovetail joints. The drawer fronts were covered in a veneer, although it wasn't holding up too well, I suspect because the rain had got in and the glue had failed. On one of the drawers, the veneer had completely peeled off. My girlfriend needed a new set of drawers, so I decided to make a new carcass for these salvaged drawers. I had 2 sheets of salvaged plywood that I'd also found by some bins. They were pretty dirty and had a few screw holes in them, but I could fill the holes and I was going to sand and paint the carcass anyway, so it didn't really matter. The ends of these sheets of plywood were not perfectly square to the sides, so I used a framing square to mark up one of the ends, clamped a straight edge against the line I'd drawn, and used it as a fence to run my circular saw against. Now that I knew that one end of the plywood was perfectly square, I measured the height that I wanted the side panels to be and marked this up with a pencil. Then I used the straight edge again to cut it to size. I used the same method again to trim the panel to the right width. I then drew around the first panel with a pencil onto the second piece of plywood and cut out this shape to give me 2 side panels for the drawer carcass. Next, I wanted to cut a rebate joint at the back of each side panel. I lowered my table saw blade to 5mm and made one pass about 5mm from the edge on each side panel. Then I adjusted the fence by a few millimeters and did a second pass on each piece to create the rebate joint. To start assembling the carcass, I clamped the side panels to one of the large drawers using 2 large bar clamps. This was just to get the 2 side panels spaced roughly the right distance apart so that I could start assembling the rest of the frame. I had some pieces of pine that were salvaged from an old bed frame. These pieces were 20mm thick and I ripped them into 20mm strips, giving me some 20mm square stock to use to build the frame. I set up a stop block at the mitre station to cut the first few strips to a length of 973mm. The large drawers that I had were 970mm wide, so I added 3mm so that the drawers would hopefully fit snugly in the carcass without too much side to side play. I added the first of these pieces to the top front of the carcass. I applied wood glue and fired in a couple of brad nails. I then cut some more pieces of the 20mm square stock to the depth of the drawers and glued and nailed these to the sides at the top. These would be top runners for the drawers. I later added screws to each top runner just to add a bit more strength. I had some thin offcuts of 5mm thick plywood. I trimmed this on the mitre saw to the length of the distance between the 2 rebate joints that I'd cut earlier on the side panels. I glued and screwed this to the back to help keep everything square, making sure that the distance between the side panels was the same at the back as it was at the front, to keep the spacing for the drawers consistent. I reinforced this back panel with another piece of pine from the inside, which I glued and screwed into place. Then I turned the whole carcass upside down. I laid the 2 small top drawers upside down, sitting on what would be the top runners if the chest was the right way up. I added another piece of the pine stock to the front to sit underneath the top 2 drawers. I attached this with glue and brad nails, leaving a gap of about 1 to 2mm between the bottom of each drawer and this piece to make sure that the drawers would fit okay. I then added a small upright piece in between the 2 drawer fronts with glue and screws. I used a small square to make sure that I was fitting this square to the horizontal piece. Then it was time to fit the bottom drawer runners for these 2 drawers. I started by clamping a framing square to the side of the carcass, flush with the front edges of the side panels, to ensure that the drawer runners would be at a perfect 90-degree angle to the sides. I could then attach the runners in the right place by pushing them up against the framing square. Again, I glued and nailed these into place and then later screwed. At this point I realised I'd need something at the back to attach a centrepiece in between the two top drawers. I really should have thought about this sooner, but luckily it was an easy fix. I just added a piece of pine slotted between the back of the drawer runners and the rear panel, and I screwed this into place. Once that was fitted, I then cut a scrap piece of melamine on the table saw to act as a divider between the two small drawers. I screwed through from the front and the back to secure this, and then added a drawer runner to the bottom of each side. Then, with the carcass flipped back over the right way up, the next thing I wanted to do was to create some drawer stops so that when the drawers were pushed in fully they would finish flush with the face of the carcass. So I used a tape measure to measure the distance between the front face and the drawer when it was pushed in as far as possible. Then I ripped a strip of wood on the table saw to that thickness, sat it on top of the drawer runners and screwed this to the back panel. And then the drawer shut pretty nicely. To finish off fitting the top two drawers, I added two top runners to the melamine divider, again leaving about 1 millimeter of play between the drawer and the runners. Then I flipped the carcass back over upside down again, and it was time to fit one of the large drawers. I used the same method again of clamping the framing square flush with the front of the side panel and pushing the drawer runners up against it. After fitting the runners, I then added the next horizontal front piece underneath the large drawer. This drawer would not close properly, and the easiest way to resolve it was just to take a fraction off the top of the drawer front. I used my block plane for this. I added some more drawer stops for this drawer just by positioning the front of the drawer flush with the face of the carcass and then going around the back and gluing and screwing in a couple of offcuts pushed up against the back of the drawer. At this point I took a break from fitting drawer runners and I started taking off the loose veneer from the drawer fronts using a chisel. It came off relatively easily, and then I used a 120 grit paper on my orbital sander to smooth over the drawer fronts. Then I followed the same process as I had before to fit the final drawer, tipping the carcass upside down, putting the drawer in place and fitting the drawer runners and drawer separator at the front, and finally the drawer stops round the back. This last drawer was a tight fit too. This time it was catching on the sides, so I used my block plane to take a small amount of material off the side of the drawer and then it slotted into place. I will finish off this chest of drawers in my next video.